Hello, welcome all. So recently, America has meddled in the affairs of the Latin American nation of Venezuela. It may seem completely unprovoked. However, the fact is, meddling in the affairs of Latin American countries really isn't that new for the United States. This isn't the first time America has toppled a Latin American regime. Recently, American President Donald J. Trump has sent in special forces to forcibly detain the Venezuelan president and leader, Nicolas Maduro. With all the misinformation out there about this event, I'd like to give a little bit of background about the history of what is going on here. Which is that in today's world of 2026, America is effectively an empire. America acts as an empire in international politics and trade. People will say that America being an empire is a bad thing. Regardless of what you think, and while it's ultimately a neutral thing, effectively having good and bad outcomes, to understand that America is an empire, I'll briefly cover what makes America an empire. To start, as to what really makes a nation an empire, like the empires of Britain, Spain, or China. Speaking of the British Empire, it had colonies across the globe. It was a superpower of its day, that being the late 18th century and into the 19th and early 20th century. The British Empire had vested interest in their colonies because of its profits and trade. To secure these profits, they meddled in other states' affairs, whether it be India, South Africa, Egypt, Canada, or any of its many colonies. None of these colonies submitted willingly, and it took a great deal of invasion and subjugation on the part of the British. The British Empire became a world power during the end of the Spanish Empire, which they were able to defeat in a series of wars and flex its power. One example of the British Empire meddling in foreign affairs being in the Opium Wars. The Opium Wars were fought between the British Empire and China, which was done for the interest of the British to organize trade with China. China had goods the British wanted. However, the Chinese had no interest in trading with Britain. But how would the British Empire get the Chinese to buy their products when the Chinese had no desire to trade with Britain? The British would end up starting to trade opium to the Chinese people, really starting in the 18th century. The things would pick up in the mid-19th century, though it was an illegal trade, largely opium from poppy fields in India. The British got many people addicted to the highly addictive substance. And so when the Chinese started to feel the effects, both socially and economically, tensions rose between the Chinese and the British flexed their navy against the Chinese. And after British forces took Nanking, and after the British had won the conflict, they obtained Hong Kong, and obtained ports on Chinese lands to trade with the Chinese. Fast forward to today, the British Empire is no more, with the British Empire of today being a rather small island with a few territories in Ireland and the surrounding islands. I give this overview of the Opium Wars to get to a point. That being, the British Empire was the superpower of its day. And today, America is a superpower much like the British Empire was. America today has a grand total of 750 military bases all over the world across 80 different countries. America also commands at the world stage with the largest defense budget in the world and the strongest military in history, all to fund such an empire. And while said empire may be crumbling today, how did it start in the first place? To find out, let's look at what destroyed the British Empire, as it was from this power vacuum of the end of the British Empire that led to the rise of the American Empire. World War II was a front largely fought in Europe and Asia. Although it happened all over the world, for America, aside from Pearl Harbor, there weren't many major attacks on American soil. Within Europe, the British were able to keep the Germans off of the British mainland, keep the fight going against the German war machine, which had reigned supreme on the ground of the continent during the war. The French, and for a long time the Russians, couldn't stand up to them. And after the Soviets routed the Germans at the Battle of Stalingrad, the war would come to Germany on two fronts and put them on the defensive. Due to the economic output of the British during the World War II and World War I, the British Empire was beginning to crumble, and with the nationalism rising in the colonies of the empire, it was on its way out. Meanwhile, America was almost untouched on the mainland. It was the death of the British Empire that led to the rise of the American. With the European powers of old dead, America and their counterpart the Soviets would rise as the new superpowers of the world. To understand how America got to be a superpower post-World War II, and to relate it to the current-day detainment of a Venezuelan leader, we'll talk of America's expansion into Latin America during the 19th century and into the early 20th. After America had pushed the Native American tribes out further west, displacing the peoples, it looked to keep expanding, starting with the Mexican-American War. The emerging American Empire had a land dispute with Mexico, and after Texas was brought into the Union, which Mexico still viewed as its territory, and disputed as to where to draw the border, the war broke out. America would send in two main armies. One would move against the Rio Grande, and the other would occupy the Southwest Territories. After the first army won a few battles, and it ended up taking Mexico City, putting the war to an end. After the war, America not only took Texas up to the Rio Grande, but also took the modern-day states of Utah, California, New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado. The next war America had for gaining interest in Latin America was the Spanish-American War. America wanted some territories in the Caribbean, and with politicians of the time wanting to expand in the late 19th century, during this time the Spanish Empire was on its last leg. It wasn't the same empire that had toppled the great empires of the old Americas. Meanwhile, Cuba wanted independence from Spain due to putting its citizens in camps. American papers told people of Cuban desires for independence and what the Spanish were doing, which got a lot of people to wanting to intervene. And when Cuba went to war for its independence, America would blame the USS Maine on Spain and go to war. The Spanish weren't ready for a big war with the United States, and it showed when America dominated the conflict, with America defeating the Spanish at the Philippines, and after America would beat the Spanish Navy, they would take Cuba. Cuba would become a protectorate, and Puerto Rico became a territory, along with the Philippines. By the end of the 19th century, and later into the early 20th century, America had obtained the Panama Canal, and after the French had abandoned the project, America saw interest in said canal. Colombia, however, still held the territory of what would eventually become the Panama Canal. America sent battleships into the area. Meanwhile, Panama leaders led the revolt largely unopposed, as Colombia had no way of getting there due to the American blockade. Colombia ultimately didn't have much of a choice and allowed Panama to become independent, and the canal would go to the United States. America used the area to create a canal connecting the two oceans. Involvement in Latin America from the United States would not stop in the early 20th century. The CIA would also have heavy involvement in the region during the Cold War. In the 1950s, during the Cold War, American CIA operatives would topple the regime within Guatemala, Jacob Guzman. Then in the 1960s, under JFK, the United States would train Cuban exiles in an attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro. Also, in the 60s would be the toppling of Brazil, then Ecuador, then Bolivia, twice, once in the 60s and again in the 70s. In Chile, Pinochet rose as an American-backed dictator, then El Salvador in the 80s, and Grenada shortly after. And in 1989, under George Bush Sr., America toppled the Panama regime. American empire building within Latin America is connected to today with the Venezuelan leader being kidnapped. America has meddled in Latin American politics since technically the Monroe Doctrine, under President James Monroe in 1823. America would pass the decree in U.S. foreign policy warning any European nations to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Since then, any threat to America within the Western Hemisphere has been snuffed out. But why? Well, like mentioned before, America is effectively an empire. The same reason Britain started a war against China for trade in opium is the same reason America meddles in Latin American affairs. It's a world power, and Latin America is right in America's backyard, meaning any situation with a threat to the country or any base of operations of an outside threat would be a threat to the center of the American empire. If any of America's rivals were to ever obtain a landing pad in Latin America, it would be a disaster. So as mentioned before, under Trump, America has once again gotten involved in Latin American affairs, effectively ending Maduro's reign in Venezuela. But how does this relate to the history of America meddling in Latin American affairs? While Trump stated that his interest with Maduro was based off the sale of narcotics within the region into the United States, what doesn't make sense with this, however, is that in Latin America, Venezuela isn't the largest producer of the drugs of fentanyl or cocaine, nor is it the largest dealer. Why not invade or topple any regime that sells illegal substance into the United States? Mexico, for instance, is a far larger supplier of fentanyl and cocaine than Venezuela is. For reference, here is a map of the drug trade into the United States. As you can see, most of it coming from Mexico and somewhat from the Caribbean, not as much from Venezuela. Also notable is the map of cocaine production. Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia with the largest of 26,400 illegally produced factories within Colombia, 3,200 in Bolivia, and 2,400 in Peru. So the idea that America kidnapped Maduro due to the drug trade between the U.S. and Venezuela simply isn't likely, which is shown by the fact that the bigger culprits of the trade are the other countries of Latin America, being Colombia and Mexico. America taking Cuba and meddling in its affairs throughout the 20th century and from the 19th century point to the same thing as the Venezuelan situation. Strategic use. Let me explain. China and Venezuela have been getting close, with China's interest within Venezuela starting in 1998 with Hugo Chavez and diplomatic ties dating back to then. However, far more pressing for America is Venezuela's modern-day ties with China being a big beneficiary of Venezuelan oil, accounting for over half of Venezuela's oil revenue. Moreover, China's bank loans, reaching $10 billion, being far larger than any other Latin American nation. Recently, in 2023, America and Venezuela entered into the all-weather strategic partnership, with Venezuela being one of several other nations to have this status in Chinese foreign affairs. Venezuela is also China's second-largest trade partner, with the United States being the largest. Venezuela's trade increased exceptionally during 2025. Chinese bank loans have also gone to Venezuela since 2015, and within 2016, China loaned $60 billion worth of oil debts to Venezuela, which Venezuela paid back with oil trade with China. 2006, America started sanctions on Venezuela. However, more sanctions were added during Trump's presidency in 2016. China made attempts to evade the American sanctions. Venezuela is also the largest Latin American buyer of Chinese weaponry, purchasing light tanks, rocket launchers, anti-tank missiles, anti-ship missiles, and armored carriers. The two also had talks of aerospace cooperation in November of 2025. With the detainment of Maduro and America backing its own oil have been taken oil operations within the country. Moreover, Maduro was detained due to Chinese involvement. America, like the empires of old, is effectively an empire and a superpower, with its history of involving itself in Latin American affairs, with CIA operations, warships in territory, or to protect its own interest. Tied back to the detainment of Maduro today, but what can we learn today from the past of American imperialism in Latin America? While America remains a global power on the world stage, Latin America will always be in its vested interest, and the detainment of Maduro was to end Chinese involvement within the country and due to American imperialism. That concludes the situation with Maduro and Venezuela. Thank you for watching.